Senator Parker. Senator Kachik on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the sponsor yield to a question?
Senator DeFrancisco, do you yield to a question?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the education portion of the budget, one of the issues our school districts have faced is the fact that some of them are actually facing educational insolvency. I'd like to ask the sponsor how he would define educational insolvency.
Educational insolvency is when kids leave high school and can't read and write. Education insolvency is when children do not perform and schools do not perform. That's education insolvency. The financial issue is part of it, but there's more to it than that. But what I'd like to do is refer these questions to the expert in education, our own John Flanagan, and he can give you a more specific answer, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Senator Kachik, do you wish Senator Flanagan to yield for a question?
Would the Senator Flanagan yield to a question?
Senator Flanagan, do you yield? Senator Flanagan yields.
So my question is, how would you define educational insolvency?
I'm going to agree with Senator Cisco.
Okay. So would Senator Flanagan yield to another question?
Yes.
Senator Flanagan continues to yield.
So just so that I understand, your definition of educational insolvency means when someone graduates high school, they can't read or write.
No, I think it's multifaceted. It goes beyond, as Senator DeFrancisco said. If you go back, I'm now in my third year chairing the Education Committee. One of the first meetings I had was with Deputy Commissioner King, who is now Commissioner King. And we talked about insolvency in a fiscal sense, in an educational sense, and in a legal sense. And everybody in the chamber knows that school districts, under the law, cannot go legally insolvent. You can have a further discussion about financial insolvency, and there'll be a whole wide variety of opinions as to how one would define that. Lack of accessibility, lack of opportunity, having curtailed programs, having disparate impacts across districts in various parts of the state, and then you can have a whole debate about educational insolvency. I know one of the areas where Senator LaValle, Senator DeFrancisco have been very outspoken is in the area of remediation. There's money in this budget for when students get into community colleges in particular to help fix some of the problems that were not righted through the elementary and secondary process. In my opinion, the single most important way to avoid any of these problems is to make sure that public education in the state of New York is properly funded.
Would the sponsor yield to a further question?
Senator Flanagan, do you yield?
Yes.
As a former school board member, one of the things we had to tackle with on our school board was how do we define a successful student? And one of the barometers we used was the children at our school district can get to college. If they apply to colleges, they get accepted. One of the barometers I would suggest, and I wanted to know if you agree with this, is that one of the things that we could use to define educational insolvency is if our children are not able to apply to college or be accepted at a college of their choosing because they don't have the educational programming at their high school to be competitive. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with it in part, but I don't think it's simply enough to talk about the actions of the legislature and what we may do in the context of a budget. We should not forget that the Commissioner and the Board of Regents sets educational policy here in the state of New York. And a lot of what you're talking about, accessibility, opportunity, starts with the message that they deliver. We're really the financing arm when you get right down to it. They're more of the policy arm. So in terms of things that are being advocated, Senator Young has been very outspoken about regional high schools. I've talked about broadband accessibility, making computers more accessible all across the state, particularly in rural communities, which you should certainly know about. Then you have concepts like distance learning, providing opportunities that may not be there originally or ones that are starting to go away. So it's with an eye on what's going on right now, but we have advanced as the Senate majority a number of proposals, frankly, within this budget as well, that would have addressed some of the points that you're raising, and the Assembly and the Executive, and the Assembly in particular, just rejected it. Regional high schools is probably the most glaring example.
Thank you. Would the Senator continue to yield.
Senator Flanagan.
Yes.
Senator Flanagan yields.
I don't disagree that there are some good things in this budget. I'm happy to see the increases in education, foundation aid, and the GEA. But I keep coming back to the reason why schools are facing educational insolvency is the lack of money to have adequate programming. My question now is that there is still in the budget $15 million for bullet aid. How is that bullet aid distributed?
That bullet aid is distributed pursuant to an agreement with the majority leader, I believe. The details of that are not in the context of this bill, or I'm not sure which one it's in, but yes, there is a pot of money.
I believe it's in this bill. Would the senator continue to yield to a question?
Yes.
Senator Flanagan yields.
Do you think, through you, Mr. President, do you think the bullet aid should be, for the most part, sent to those school districts that are facing educational insolvency?
Well, I think the bullet aid should be distributed to school districts that find themselves in difficult financial situations. If you want to differentiate between financial insolvency and educational insolvency, but no matter what time you come up with a budget or what year you come up with a budget, even when it's well-intentioned, and I think this is a very strong educational product, no matter how you do it, there's always a few people that somehow seem to fall through the cracks. And what we've tried to do in large part is help plug holes, and I can pick out districts right in my own county of Suffolk, some that came out on the shorter end of the stick this year, and if people were asking me about bullet aid, that would be an area that I would be looking at, and frankly, I would be no different than any one of my colleagues, because as everyone got the school runs today, people looking to go, okay, good, bad, not so good, this is where we have a problem, and that is after coming up with 10 different tiers on ways to improve what the governor advanced to us. So it's not, again, there's a whole litany of factors that need to be considered.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Flanagan. On the bill?
Senator Kachuk on the bill.
I'm very happy with some of the additional funding in this bill. With the inclusion of my hostile amendment, it would have been better because we would have been able to eliminate the gap elimination adjustment and revamp the school aid formula in its entirety. But as it's drafted, we do add $176 million for the gap elimination aid and $196 million to the school aid formula. But as you described, there's changes. We don't really know how that is impacting all of the school districts since we just got the runs a couple hours ago. It really needs to be looked at and talked to the schools to see how they're being impacted by that. And I would certainly urge the Republican majority, when they do disperse the bullet aid, that they focus that aid on schools that have needs. Either they're facing educational insolvency or have financial issues. But there are some of the other good things in the bill that it does restore high tax aid to 2008-2009 levels. And there is relief in the form of a mandate relief in that internal audits are no longer expected for schools that are below 1,500 in size. Collectively, these will help, but I am still worried. I am worried that the damage our schools have seen over the last 3 years is not going to be made up in this one budget bill. I'll give you an example of the Fonda-Fultonville School District. It serves almost half of Montgomery County. They have 1,400 kids. It's a K-12 school. They've been cutting staff and programs over the past 3 years. The end of last year, they had to pay out over $1 million in catastrophic health care costs, which forced them to make mid-year budget cuts of over $500,000. They had a pool, it's been closed years ago. They only have a few AP classes. There wasn't much to cut. What they cut, they eliminated their business program and they laid off their school psychologist. I have a problem with that. Their school sports teams rely on their bus drivers and coaches who volunteer their time. The unions have also agreed to concessions of almost $500,000. This budget may help them stop cutting and keep the pink slips in the superintendent's office this year. But if we want to make long-term structural changes, we need to do things like committing to eliminating the gap elimination adjustment so that we can stabilize funding to rural and small city schools. I will be voting aye on this bill, but I sincerely hope that we are not done continuing to work together to improve financial conditions and educational opportunities for all of our children. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kachuk. Senator Latimer.
President, on the bill,
Senator Latimer on the bill.
This bill is a good example, touched on it before, I'm not the only person that shared this thought, that the way we do our budgets in New York State really requires a significant overhaul. Whether that overhaul is going to happen or not is very problematic, because I certainly understand the system to know that it benefits certain things happening. But a bill like this takes so many disparate issues that are not all necessarily budgetary, and putting them in one lump sum like this makes it very, very difficult for individuals as well as legislators to deal with each of these policy issues the way they should be dealt with, which is individually on the merits of each of those issues. This is very much like one of those gift baskets that you either receive or give at Christmas time. And inside that gift basket is a bottle of wine, there's a can of nuts, there's some cookies, there's some fruit, and when you open up the gift basket, you like the wine, you don't like the peanut brittle, you like the shortbread cookies, but you don't like the kumquats, but you have to either take the whole basket or send it back to your aunt and say, sorry, I didn't really like this basket. In this basket of this bill are things, and a number of us have said it before, that are good public policy statements. I mentioned a couple of days ago I was concerned about the Governor's Moreland Commission recommendations. They're in this bill, and it's a very good step in that direction. In this bill, as others have mentioned other different areas, in this bill is pension smoothing, which is very controversial. But the city of Yonkers wants the opportunity to use pension smoothing. So the city of Yonkers needs a bill like this to pass for them to have that option. Those schools that were affected by the loss of high tax aid will be benefited by this. But my colleagues and I have spoken passionately about the minimum wage, and that the minimum wage issue is also in this bill and is distasteful to those of us, which include the governor, whose original proposal was $8.75, and the Assembly, all of which wanted a very different product than what we had at the end. Perhaps CSI Albany in one of the future episodes will cover what happened here. And as many of us do when we don't really know what's going on, we read Liz Benjamin and we read the different blogs, and perhaps the blogs will tell us what happened, how we started out one place and ended up in another place. I do want to talk on one topic that was not addressed in this bill, and I recognize my friend Senator Flanagan has been outspoken on this topic, and if it's not going to be in the bill, it still bears being heard in a public domain, and that's the plight of the 853 schools. Those schools serve over 15,000 New York's most needy and vulnerable students. And those programs and the financing of that has been frozen for 4 years, the Department of Budget. Now, that problem creates a difficulty for these schools, which this bill and this budget does not address. We're going to have to deal with them down the line. These schools are unable to access private credit. They're dealing with very low, if any, reserves, and they don't have the geographic constituency that we have with our geographic school districts, where there's a group of parents and a group of individuals that care deeply about it. So I would say this is now unfinished business for those of us who care. We understand it's not a broad-based constituency, but it is something that, while omitted in this budget, has to be addressed going forward. I intend to vote for this bill knowing that I find the minimum wage provisions unacceptable, knowing that the APPR arrangements, as relates not only to the New York City district, but to other districts that didn't get the headlines, like Harrison, that I represent, and 2 other districts around the state, were not dealt with, I think, appropriately or fairly. But I think the real story, and not that I expect it to be addressed today or tomorrow or a year from now or even a decade from now, the way we do these budgets, putting disparate issues together, is a disservice to democracy.
Senator Hoylman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the sponsor yield to a question?
Would you like Senator Flanagan to yield on
Yes,
education?
please.
Senator Flanagan.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know which senator would be best, but I asked for the sponsor, but
They both stand ready.
they both stand ready. Okay. I guess the question then, sir, to either, is if you've evaluated what the fiscal impact on New York City of the requirement in this bill to expand bus service to private school students who attend classes after 4 p.m.
Senator Flanagan.
Yes, there have been extensive discussions on this subject, and it's not the only area of non-public schools that are involved in the budget. There's increases for mandated services aid and things like that. Essentially, the agreement that has been worked out would provide additional opportunities, provide additional flexibility, has incentives for potential cost savings, and for now, in this year, in this budget, would ultimately provide a cap so that there could, if there were an expansive growth in the program, that we would be able to get that in more detail, and I believe the number is $5.6 million.
Would the senator continue to yield?
Senator yields.
Yes.
So in future years, sir, are there estimations of what the expanded bus service will cost the city of New York? Beyond the $5 million?
No.
Thank you.
Because part of this started last year. There was an understanding of what it may be, and now we've moved ahead incrementally. I think it's an enhancement on what was started last year. I think it addresses issues of safety involving children all across the city of New York, and I can't theorize as to what that number will be until we have further implementation of what's now going to be in this budget.
Would the senator continue to yield?
Senator yields.
Yes.
Are you aware, sir, that the representatives from the city's Department of Education have estimated costs upwards of $100 million or more in future years?
I have actually heard numbers as high as $300 million, neither of which I believe. I think it is mere conjecture on their part. There have been extensive discussions amongst all the various parties and the staff. My colleagues, I've spoken to Senator Golden, Senator Lanza, Senator Felder. Let's put it this way. I don't believe those numbers are accurate, even at the extreme or at the $100 million, but the value of what we've done is provide additional funding with a cap. So if for some reason things go askew and all of a sudden there's some exponential growth, that can be adjusted. But I have not seen anything that would detail for me or for you or for anyone, frankly, in this legislature, where the $100 million is.
On the bill, sir?
Senator Hoylman on the bill.
Mr. President, I think it is the height of fiscal irresponsibility that this unfunded mandate has not been thoroughly examined, clearly, as my colleague has stated, especially in these very difficult economic and fiscal times for New York City's 1.1 million school students. We've heard from my colleagues, New York City is already facing $240 million in cuts and maybe upwards of $1 billion in 5
Senator
years.
Flanagan, why do you rise?
If I may finish, I'm happy
Senator
to entertain
Hoylman,
a
I'm
question.
recognizing the member who has risen.
If you would
Senator
yield to a
Flanagan, why do you
question when
rise?
you're finished.
Yes, sir.
Senator Hoylman, you may continue.
So in addition to the $240 million and $1 billion in 5 years from the teacher evaluation fiasco, we're also have lost in New York City our AIM funding. That's $300 million annually and $260 million in Race to the Top funds. The fact that an arrangement which has not been thoroughly examined, which we do not know the upper limits, in a chamber that prides itself in fiscal austerity and a close examination of numbers, I think, Mr. President, is appalling, and for that reason I will oppose this bill.
Senator Flanagan?
I actually have a two-part question based on what you just said. Are you aware that the money that we're providing is aidable through the transportation formula, so it is not an unfunded mandate. It's not completely funded, it is certainly not unfunded. That's the whole point of the money coming from the state of New York, to mitigate what the cost may be for the city of New York. I just want to make sure that you're aware of that.
Senator Janaris, I'm going to do two things. Senator Janaris, please. Senator Hoylman, you do yield, correct? Senator Hoylman? Senator Hoylman? Senator Hoylman, you do yield, correct?
Yes.
And then I'm going to remind the members to please direct their questions and answers through the chair. Senator Janaris?
That was my point as well. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
President.
Directed my question through the chair previously and waited till the senator finished before imposing it. So, Senator Hoylman, do you agree that this is transportation aidable?
Mr. President, I agree that there is some aid for New York City in this scheme. I do, though, would like to ask my colleague a question, if he will yield.
Senator Hoylman, let's continue right now. You had yielded to Senator Flanagan, so if you'll answer the questions, and Senator Flanagan, will you yield to Senator Hoylman?
Yes, I had said I had
Okay.
a two-part question. The second part, and I realize this has created a tremendous amount of consternation. I will tell you exactly what is my understanding on the APPR as it relates to the city of New York. And trust me, there have been tons of discussions, public and private. I don't believe there's any question that the money for 2012-13, $240 million, is gone. In this budget, today, going forward, that money is in the base for the city of New York. So while I appreciate what you're saying about the cumulative loss, I believe that's inaccurate, and that the city would be protected, and that money is built into the base in this budget and going forward.
And if
Do you
this-
agree?
Senator Hoylman?
I will say that the mandate, which could be called unfunded, could be called partially funded, is something with an upper limit that the senator has admitted he does not know the extent of. And I would also like to ask the senator if he would agree that the transportation fund will not cover New York City's cost 100% for
Senator
the
Hoylman,
private
are you
bus
asking
service.
Senator Flanagan to now yield?
Yes, sir.
Senator Flanagan, do you yield?
Yes.
And I would ask again, I would remind the members to please direct through the chair. Senator Flanagan?
Mr. President, I believe I understand your question correctly. You had suggested that this was an unfunded mandate. I differentiated to say that it is a funded mandate, not in its entirety. And that's part of the point. I said there was a $5.6 million appropriation, and that would offset some of the costs that would be incurred by the city of New York. I don't represent to you at all that it's fully funded. But certainly at the same time, it is not unfunded. There was money appropriated to the city to address some of their concerns. And I'm not sure I heard you on the point about the $240 million. Are you aware that that is now back in the base for the city of New York on top of the $363 million that the city is getting as a result of this budget?
Senator Hoylman?
Mr. President, I acknowledge that there has been discussions about New York City receiving some of that money back in the budget. We, on the Democratic aisle, have not seen evidence of that. And also, I would also point out that $5 million with an expense budget for providing public transportation to private students, public transportation for private students could cost upwards of $100 million. That, sir, is a drop in the bucket.
Thank you, Senator Flanagan.